Next curve.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Leonard Lee. I'm the managing director and founder of NextCurve, and thank you for attending this episode of our Rethink podcast. And in today's podcast, we are going to be talking about Apple Silicon. And today, I have joining me Dean Freeman, who is a research fellow with NextCurve. He's a former Gartner analyst. He was with the semiconductor team there for quite some time. Dean, welcome.
Thank you, Leonard, and good day to all.
At last week's WWDC, or Worldwide Developer Conference, Apple announced Apple Silicon, which was met with quite a lot of excitement. I think it was long anticipated. It was something that a lot of industry experts out there thought was going to eventually happen anyways. But it finally happened. They made a formal announcement. Tim Cook made the formal announcement, and they indicated that they would be transitioning from Intel-based processors for their Macs to their own ARM-based processors, or SOCs, actually, is probably a more accurate description of what they're moving towards. So, Dean, what were your impressions? What are some of your thoughts and what this means for Apple? Why don't we start with that?
Well, Leonard, I think you're spot on with saying it's been one of those things that has been expected nearly forever, or at least as long as Apple started hiring silicon engineers. I equate it to that couple that has been dating for 10 years, and they finally get engaged, and everybody says, "Thank God, finally, it's happened." So I think it's just been the most anticipated announcement for like the last 5 years in the semiconductor space and industry. And I think just several things came together to make it happen. And I think Tim Cook finally pulled the trigger on it to say, let's move forward on this with our new Macs going forward. So it's an interesting announcement. It's one that's been long expected. And it's the last, to a certain extent, piece of the puzzle from a processor perspective for the Apple products. All the iPhones and everything and tablets are already on Apple Silicon. So now we're just adding the PCs or the Macs to the Apple Silicon family line as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there's so much fanfare about this move, given that Macs comprise, let's say, I think it's about 10% of Apple's revenue in any given quarter. It's not necessarily the fastest growing segment. And then in terms of market share, Apple's at around 6%. So it's really interesting to see how the industry has reacted to this move now that it's been formally announced and that Apple has actually announced the plan. So it looks like over the next 2 years, they're going to be transitioning their line to the new Apple Silicon. And but during that time, they're still going to continue to sell Intel-based Macs.
I think the fanfare is a bit of, it's finally happened. It's a feather in the cap for ARM, which has had several wins over the last couple of weeks. And so it's finally consummated, so to speak. And anytime Intel gains or loses business, the industry tends to make a lot of noise about it.
Right.
So I think those three things coming together are sort of what you saw in the fanfare. And because I had other conference running consecutive to WWDC, I was not able to watch the conference directly. But it sounded like this was one of the big pieces of news that they announced, that they didn't talk a lot about other new products from an iPhone perspective or anything else. This was sort of the keynote news that came out.
Yeah.
So as a result, all the Apple coverage or all the Apple reporters are covering that and saying, woohoo, it's finally happened.
Yeah. Well, I think it has a pretty narrow impact on their portfolio, but I think from a supply chain perspective, especially for the Mac, it's pretty significant, right? Given that when you look at the Mac itself, there's a good deal of vendor diversity in the different companies that non-Apple companies or non-Apple components that actually go into a Mac versus, let's say, an iPhone. And so I think traditionally for the GPU, for instance, that's AMD. AMD has been supplying the Radeon GPUs for most of the lineup, the Mac lineup for quite some time. And then, of course, you have Intel. And so there's these other players that are now seem to be poised to be deprecated, let's say. I don't know if that's a good word to describe this, but deprecated from the portfolio of a supply chain portfolio for the Mac. And so I think there's a degree of supply chain simplification that's happening here. And then, I think it's interesting because the Mac itself, it is, though it is becoming more and more of a creator's machine versus, let's say, a consumer machine. I think this is one of the things that you and I talked about before. It's evolving into an interesting place in the Apple portfolio, where typically we see a lot these PC workloads and applications that are archetypical of what we think of a desktop and a laptop now start to show up more prominently in Apple's devices, such as the new iPad. I think we're seeing the role of the Mac, whether it's the MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air or the higher end Mac Pros. I think the role of these machines are changing, and it's interesting to see mobile silicon technology now migrate itself up into what was traditionally considered the higher end device segment of Apple's portfolio. Because only 10 years ago we were laughing at the compute power of a smartphone, right? And about that time, PCs were peaking in terms of performance, and we're starting to overpower the average need of a user. And so I think this is a really interesting dynamic that's happening, but we're also seeing the evolution of the device itself. And maybe it's indicative of what's happening going to be happening in the industry going forward for the PC.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Leonard. I think the PC now is more of a desktop tool for everybody. Doesn't, we know what the power limitations and applications are. We're not going to do a lot of AI on our PCs. We're going to use a server for that application and then access that through our desktop or our notebook. So I think that aspect, we're seeing the PC now become more of that everyday tool. So get that balance. Okay, am I a high-tech AI geek that needs to go in and use x86 architecture for everything that I do? Or, am I a creator, and do I like the ease of use of an Apple product in order to make that happen? And as you talk about the supply chain, this, I think, is from a financial perspective and a technology perspective, is a really good move for Apple, because now they get to close in around their supply chain. And now they're going to have, TSMC is probably going to make this device. This may be one of the reasons why you see TSMC moving to the United States as part of this pressure, although that fab is not even nowhere as big enough to build all the processors that Apple's going to need for the Apple Silicon and the Mac cases. The other thing that you're going to see on this is it's going to potentially reduce Apple's costs, which will help their profitability. Because when consider that Intel gets about, their gross margin is around 50%. Now that profitability comes back closer to home for Apple, that they're not paying Intel the exorbitant prices they were for processors. They'll still pay a pretty penny at TSMC, but they're going to have much more control as well as creative control over the process those devices are made.
Not only is the mobile silicon starting and mobile device architectures now moving into the PC segment, whether, across all classes, it's also apparent that the software model is also moving that way as well, right? So when you look at the types of computing that's going to be happening, the way that developers are going to design applications may start to look very different on the Mac than it did in the past, right? Because when you look at what the Mac is going to have with the Apple Silicon in it, you're going to have a image processor, right? You're going to have Apple's GPU probably in all likelihood. You're going to have a neural processor. You're going to have all these different devices that are going to be integrated into this SOC that we typically associate with a smartphone, right? So a mobile computing platform now, some of these components now being in a PC form factor. So all of a sudden you have different types of, the developer has different types of resources to work with in developing applications. And I think that's probably one of the big implications from a developer's perspective, as well as from an app perspective, that we can anticipate going forward with this transition.
Oh, definitely. I think this opens up a whole new world for Apple. Before you're a little bit dependent upon what are the x86 developers creating for my PC. Well, Apple had between 2 to 6% market share. They're the very end of the tail when you consider all the other PC manufacturers out there. x86 architecture for Apple, well, okay, we'll consider it. So you had to have your own internal Apple developers working on products or applications for that PC. Now you unlock the door and you can take anybody that's been developing an app for an Apple product, from iPhones, iPads, and the PC, and get all that ecosystem working together. So it's really going to potentially create a very powerful software ecosystem that I don't think Apple really has had before on their PC.
And then all those developers, right? So you're going to have a bunch of massive, millions of developers who are very savvy with the iOS and the iPad OS toolkits, in Xcode. They know how to develop these mobile applications. Now making that transition into the Mac world is going to be much easier. It's almost like this group of developers all of a sudden has an entirely new class of devices that they can play with, which is it's pretty massive if you think about it in terms of implication.
They've got a little bit more powerful compute. Apple's processor for their cell phones is pretty powerful. When you throw in the memory and the graphics and the other software that you have on a PC, it should make it even more user-friendly for those folks that are using Macs. So my one concern in all of this, while it doesn't apply to the developers, applies to the supply chain, is this 2-year transition process. How much onboarding is going to take place for the Mac users that are just going to wait until that PC or that Mac, with the new processor emerges onto the marketplace?
We've talked about Intel quite a bit. Obviously, Intel is going to be directly impacted by this, but maybe we can talk a little bit about the implications of this move on Intel. I think there's some of the obvious, but maybe Dean, you can share with us some of the not so obvious.
There's several things that are going to happen with Intel on this. The most obvious is, okay, I lose my Apple business. Does that matter? Well, if you take a look at what's been happening in the PC market over the last, I would say, 2 years, Intel's had trouble keeping up. Ever since they lost BK, and even before they lost BK as the CEO, they were not able to provide all the x86s that they needed to for the marketplace. So now I eliminate 2 or 3% of my x86 for PCs. All right, that now provides me a cushion. What do I do with that cushion? Well, Intel is extremely interested in server technology, analytics, IoT, neuromorphic compute, quantum compute. So that frees up resources that Intel now can throw at these very rapidly emerging markets. When you take a look at what's going on with respect to edge compute, local server farms, when you take a look at the amount of compute that we're trying to put in at the edge, when you take a look at what is going on with respect to, call it, larger base stations that are acting as an edge compute space, you're really seeing a lot of business from a higher end, more profitable product than Intel can now refocus on. So I don't think that they're crying in their milk. I think they're actually saying, giving a big sigh of relief, saying, okay, now we've got a little bandwidth that we can now figure out how we're going to go attack these other markets. The new CEO in one of the conference calls that I listened to, I don't know if it was a analyst day or if it was a quarterly conference call, it talked about the fact that, maybe we're still going to be prevalent in the PC, but we're willing to lose little market share in that market to go after and try to dominate the server market or some parts of the edge compute market.
For a lot of those opining on how this is a bit of a small bit of the sky falling for Intel, I just don't see that happening. And also, now that they have this 2-year transition period, just to your point, Dean, they have the opportunity to refocus. It does seem that Intel is looking more at sort of these ubiquitous compute opportunities, these cloud-based, edge cloud type opportunities versus really getting too crazy about endpoint devices, whether it's, especially the PC. Well, they're not doing too shabby there to begin with. So I don't think it's really anything to sweat about. But definitely for Apple, it's an inevitable thing that I think is going to unshackle them from the rest of the device players in the market, right? Where now, to your point earlier, where you mentioned TSMC, they'll be able to take advantage of more advanced nodes and create devices that are like now at the 7, 5, and eventually the 2 nanometer that TSMC is working on. So that allows them to have more command of their product roadmap. And it's going to be interesting to see how they progress the whole concept of the PC, because in all likelihood, the architecture of these new devices that are based on an Apple Silicon will look quite different. And when you open the and examine the innards of these devices, they're probably going to be pretty unfamiliar. Well, they're going to be unfamiliar for a PC, but they might look a hell of a lot similar to a smartphone, right? In terms of packaging, that's another thing that you and I talked about. These things are going to probably be architected in a very unique way, which could possibly set the standard for the PC going forward.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. There wasn't a lot said about what type of core they're going to use, what the configuration is going to look like. So we're going to have to wait probably till one of our first teardowns or ARM or Apple at a future conference releases, right, what this thing looks like. You know, the A76 is the current technology. Will it be an A77? The A76 is 10 nanometer. I'm sure ARM's already been working furiously at 7 and 5 nanometer cores that are rolling out on certain products for, I would say, cell phone and FPGA clients and graphics clients. But from a PC processor, we haven't seen that yet. So you may see it look like, as you said, a little bit more like an application processor, but it depends upon, to a certain extent, how the Apple architects configure the PC or the Mac.
Yeah.
Do they reconfigure the innards to behave more like a mobile device, or do they continue down the same road that we've known for many years with respect to a personal computer in the form of a Macintosh?
Yeah, well, they have this beautiful thing called virtualization these days, and software defined everything. So they have a lot of latitude and a lot of options to work with. And I think that brings us to our last topic here, which is what can users expect or customers expect?
I think it's going to be a more seamless Apple ecosystem than we've seen in the past. Last time I used a Mac was about 2 years ago when I was transitioning between positions. And I was a little frustrated personally because even though it's supposed to have be very user-friendly, I've been using a PC for, let's see, 30 years. I've had 3 Mac experiences in my working life. And then, well, been on a x86 architecture most of the time. And I actually found that there were differences between my iPhone, which is my own Apple product, and the Macintosh I was using. And so as I was trying to figure that out and work that out, there was a little bit of a frustration. I think if Apple can take the Macintosh and make it more of, I'll call it using their mobile architecture, where I've got buttons and icons and things like that I press versus having to go in and search and find things, it may mean a more seamless transition. And as I always used to use for my basis of full adoption, my mother-in-law would be able to come onto a Macintosh with those icons and bam, she'd be up and running in no time versus, all right, how do I do this on an x86 product? So I think you're going to see a more seamless ecosystem. I also think what you're going to see happen, and this is kind of a side note of what happened at the Apple conference, is you're going to start to see the Apple ecosystem become more inclusive, I think, whereas they've always struggled with their iHome products. And now I think as they start to make more of their own silicon, get more the ability for applications engineers or developers to use the Mac platform even more so, you'll start to see the entire Apple ecosystem really wrap around itself in a very large cocoon and be much user-friendly, if you say that for the Apple, because it already is one of the more user-friendly ecosystems. But I think you will start to see this allow them to step up a little bit with respect to the smart home, as well as maybe some automotive applications that are coming out that we don't know about yet.
So my take on it is that to the average user or to most users, not going to notice it at all.
Yeah,
not going to notice a change, and I think that's the whole point. I've read a lot of articles about how, oh wow, this is going to have huge implications for the the consumer and the users of Mac. And, I think the whole point, and it was a point that seems to be missed by many folks who are opining on this topic, is that the whole idea is that it's seamless, that you don't have this Microsoft compatibility mode moment where you have software that just simply doesn't work across different major platform changes. And the idea here with the announcement of Rosetta 2, being able to do the translation of old code into the new code upon installation, just in time, JavaScript translation, and all these other nice bells and whistles that they're including, not only in Big Sur, which is the next version of Mac OS, but also into Xcode. You're ideally not going to notice anything. You're going to go from when you have this new Mac, you're going to be able to run the old stuff and then all the new stuff, and all the new stuff should ideally, for the most part, run on your Intel-based Mac. So if they're able to do that, and if there's any company in the world, I think you could arguably say Apple's the one that can do it. They're the one that can do it simply because they have complete control over the entire stack, which I think becomes it is a huge competitive advantage, because if you try to imagine Microsoft or Dell or whoever trying to do this stuff, it's just structurally not possible, which I think this is one of the reasons why Apple is in a unique position, strategic position. And quite frankly, I think that's one of the reasons why this move is such a tectonic shift in the PC space. And will have broad implications going forward. I think it's a telling event.
I would agree with you, Leonard. Yeah, it's going to be simpler, and it's going to be pretty much transparent to the end user.
And I think the only question that consumers have to ask themselves is, well, what's the product obsolescence life cycle going to look like? Are we going to be buying new PCs every 2 years? Or, now people are holding on to their iPhones for quite a long time. And, Apple tends to support these devices for 6 years, which is nice. I mean, that's growing, right? It went from 4 to 5 to 6 to now, I think there's some products that go out to 7 years, which is for, devices, that's quite a long time, especially those devices that are closest to our person, like the smartphone, right? So that's, I think, the one thing that will be interesting, because in a way, you're moving away from a lot of discrete components that are put together in more of a modular fashion into a device that's probably a little bit more black box-ish, right?
Yeah.
It comes configured and that's it. You have to live with that for X number of years. So it'll be interesting to see how modular the new Macs are in terms of what you can switch in, switch out, and then how it'll be able to extend and not only of its capabilities and capacity and performance, but going forward, but how it can how consumers can future-proof it beyond what you would expect from the obsolescence life cycle of a smartphone, which is typically about 2-3 years, right?
Yep.
Arguably, although if you're a power user, you're definitely switching out your stuff every 2 years, if not one, like me.
Yeah. Well, my wife's on the other side. We just retired her iPhone 5 this last week. So,
oh, congratulations! Did you bury it in the backyard?
You know what? You can still get money for those things.
Hey, Dean. Thanks for joining. This was really fun. This was a good conversation, and thanks for sharing your insights. I hope everyone who is listening enjoyed the banter here, and thanks for joining us today. If you're interested in getting detailed insights on Apple Silicon and our thoughts on the implications of this move by Apple on your business, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have a briefing with you. And if there's any advisory services that we can provide, we're more than happy to work with you on that. And you can contact me at leonard.lee@next-curve.com. And if you're interested in any of our research, please go to our research blog. It's www.next-curve/insights. And we will be back soon with another episode of Rethink on things that inspire our digital future. So with that, keep healthy and safe. Dean, again, thank you so much. And everyone have a beautiful day.
All right. Bye, all.
Visit us at www.next-curve.com.